We'll be discussing all the changes in the data landscape, and there have been quite a few. In fact, the preamble is probably going to be most of this talk. Sorry, Mark. I do want to say, I think if you're following along on the agenda, there may have been a scheduled break. Just in the interest of time, we're going to move forward for that. The advantage is you get 2 cocktails sooner. So I am delighted to introduce Mark Schaan, the Director General of Marketplace Framework Policy Branch for Innovation, Science and Economic Development, also known as ISED. And now I'm going to read this because this is long. In this role, Mark helps advise on issues relating to laws of general economic application, which include, now correct me if I'm wrong, but competition, corporate governance, bankruptcy and insolvency, all of the intellectual property statutes, privacy, and data protection. Did I miss any?
Nope.
Ooh, I'm getting better at this. So we'll circle back on what exactly Mark does in a minute. But you may have picked up on the theme of the summit, the Data Summit, which is data. So there's a reason for that, and that is because the landscape for data has changed terribly in the last, well, not terribly, but it's changed a lot in the last year and a half. So now people are thinking about data in a way they didn't before. So we have our polling question up there. This one's a little different. In this case, you have a data genie. You also have data in your organizations. So you get to solve any data problem in your organization. So which one are you going to choose? And I'll just give you a few minutes to think that through. Wow. Okay, Mark, there's a message for you.
I somehow knew that was coming.
We'll just give this the technology and satellites and I don't know what else, the fiber networks. Give it another few seconds here. Okay, I think we're starting to see a theme emerge, and this is interesting. This is actually consistent with my own practice. Everybody hates records retention, which is why I do records retention, because everyone wants it off of their desk and put it on mine. Castles is very interesting. I would have thought there'd be more castle malingerers. It's a fabulous piece of legislation. So all this data is now being regulated. So the question becomes, can companies keep up? So let's just survey what companies are going to keep up with. So I have here the landscape. So those of you that follow this, the Privacy Commissioner issued its guidance on meaningful consent. That started being applied in January, as of January 1st, 2019. There was a consultation paper on transborder flows of personal information. That's since been discontinued in light of the Digital Charter, and we'll get to that. Of course, there's the PIPEDA amendments, or the PIPEDA amendments, and I'm going to have to get a vote from you on how it's actually pronounced.
PIPEDA.
Okay, PIPEDA. There you have it. If you take nothing else away from the seminar.
Exactly.
There's the PIPEDA amendments that had the mandatory breach reporting. Those came into effect November 1st. Competition Department has been very active in this. They published their Big Data and Innovation Key Themes for Competition Policy and just held their Competition Data Forum. As you may have been following the headlines, the Digital Charter was released a couple of weeks ago along with the action plan. If you aren't familiar with these, on your table should be a bound volume that has a copy of the Digital Charter, the action plan, and what was also released with that was a proposed PIPEDA modernization discussion paper, and that's in there as well. We will send you the links to all of these things so you don't have to fight over the materials on the table, because I think there's probably only one or two. And then, of course, there's if you watch CPAC, and I know all of you do, you have been riveted to the last year or so of Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics Review, and, of course, ISED's response to all of that, and the Standing Committee on Industry, Science, and Technology, because there is nothing more exciting than the statutory review of CASL. I highly encourage you. The videos are online, people. It's great. Netflix is looking to franchise that. So that's what's been going on in the landscape. All of it's Mark's fault. So Mark, who are you and what do you do?
Well, as you indicated, I'm the Director General of Marketplace Framework Policy, and so my team does all of the policy trend analysis, research, stakeholder management, issue management, and ultimately kind of policy development and reform options and legislative reform related to all those statutes you kind of laid out. So birth to death of a corporation. And then my part-time job is really appearing before parliamentary committees. And so I think in this parliamentary session, I've appeared before committee, I think we're up to 55 times, including this morning, which is why I'm sorry I couldn't be here.
Tell the audience about the committee you had this morning. I didn't even know this committee, I'm sure there's a waiting list to get on this committee.
This morning, I, for the second time, appeared before the Standing Joint Committee on the Scrutiny of Regulations, where I was appearing related to a transitional regulatory package we put on the Patented Medicines Notice of Compliance regulations in 2015.
So there you go. Looking for a job as a civil servant? Talk to Mark. Doesn't get any more exciting than that. Okay, so now we know what you do, or part of what you do.
Yeah.
And some people are horrified. Let's talk about the digital charter. The announcement of the digital charter a few weeks ago caught a lot of people's attention. It set out essentially 10 principles to guide modernization of the rules that govern the digital sphere in Canada. Generally well received. But there was criticism that it's not binding and therefore it's ineffectual. So what exactly is the digital charter?
Yeah, so maybe I'll back up slightly and say, so, my team, amongst many others in the government of Canada, have been working with our ministers who have been seized by questions related to kind of the changing nature of the digital landscape and the data and digital driven economy, and also the data and digitally driven society, which is why, and I make that distinction because not all of data and digital is necessarily even commercial. Lots of it's actually about just how we run our lives or how we interact with one another, sometimes in a for-profit space, but sometimes not. And then also how we do things like run elections, which also comes up in the charter. And so we'd been really seized by a number of these questions. It was the heart of Minister Baines's national data and digital consultations that we ran last summer. And as we kind of wrapped up that effort and tried to think about where we were going, two things became very clear. One was the ubiquitous nature of these questions. And so the fact that there's absolutely no file that doesn't seem to have some data or digital environment question or implication. The second is what that means for us is that it's every government department, it's every kind of minister, if everybody's got an oar in this. And then the third was that action in this space has been taken and will need to be continued to be taken, but it has to be extremely thoughtful and extremely coherent, and it has to actually be cohesive in the sense that what we do with the one side can't come at what we do with the other. And so that really landed us on the charter, which was, can we tell Canadians? So the thing that we heard loudest and clearest out of the national data and digital consultations was, yes, from segments of the private sector, fix Castle, but from the other segments, particularly the Canadian citizen segment, was, I have palpable anxiety about how I am operating in this data and digital space. I am wary and deeply concerned about how my data is being used, by who and for what. And yes, I'm participating, and I'm participating at a rate and at a volume that may look like I don't care. It may look like I'm actually consenting to every one of those terms of service agreements, but actually, fundamentally, I'm becoming increasingly distrustful. And so to that end, I think the goal of the charter was, can we can we anchor some of that anxiety in a way to say, well, this is where we're going to get you. This is where we're going to go. And so the charter is a whole of government approach to an end state. It's even beyond whole of government in the sense that it says, this is where we think we need to go. Here's 10 things that we want to kind of promise or kind of acknowledge as what we see as a good place to arrive at. That's going to take sustained effort. That's going to take significant investment. That's going to take activity from the private sector, the public sector, civil society, and citizens themselves. And so, you can take any one of them. You can take, universal access and say, well, high-speed connectivity, it's in the budget. It says we'll have it by 2030, but that's a multi-billion-dollar investment, and not just by government. And I think that's an indicative kind of piece of the charter that lays out, this is where you're going. to really build a foundation of trust. Because absent that, I think this whole data economy and this whole data society potentially runs the risk of falling flat.
That's very comprehensive. So for organizations, how should they be thinking about the digital charter?
Well, so we have consulted consistently and constantly on these issues. And so I know some of the anxieties from some corporates were oh God, someone's going to show up in my bank or my institution tomorrow and say, you said in principle 3 that I have consent and control over my data, and moreover, you said in 4 that I have portability, and so I'd like to move my data, please. Can I have it, and can you move it? That's where it's really important to say to corporates, this is an end state that we need to get to. But I'd say, more importantly, it's a partnership model that's going to take all of us to get there. I think they should interpret it as an end state. I think they should see this as, in some ways, writing on the wall in certain segments or in certain sectors to say, okay, this actually, the government's actually serious about some of these constructs, including things like portability or heightened control or heightened transparency. But then also, I think, and it's super wonky and super nerdy of me, and so you can forgive me, but in the back end of that PIPEDA discussion paper is a conceptual framework that sort of lays out kind of how we've articulated how this all might work together, which is that
it's beautiful, by the way, if you want to open the book.
So, you modernize framework laws on the bottom half, which is kind of, so you actually bring them into line with the modernized economy, and that applies to everyone. You then layer on top of that activity-based regulation, and I use activity-based kind of on purpose, whereas we used to have sector-based regulation. Sectors don't exist anymore. So if I was thinking about banking, for instance, it's not just banks that I need to regulate. It's actually lending that I need to regulate, or it's payments, or it's holdings. And you build on top of that standard certifications and codes, and kind of voluntary efforts or mandatory efforts that either build on top of that and fuel that effort. And then on top of that, you build kind of global or interoperability and kind of international efforts to do things like either trade agreements or adequacy or various other kind of efforts. And the reason I point that out is I think that third layer, certification, standards, and codes, the more that gets done in that space lightens the load potentially over what needs to get done in either 1 or 2. And that's not to say that we won't be coming for some certain elements of 1 and 2. So don't read me wrong. I'm not going to say PIPED is voluntary. You did such a good job of regulating yourself.
You heard it. You heard it here, folks.
But I do think that that's the effort that if I was a commercial entity at the moment and I was trying to read tea leaves and say, what do they mean by this? I'd say, oh, I probably should be thinking about how I'm heightening transparency. I should probably be thinking about how I'm providing greater control. Oh, I should probably be thinking about whether or not I'm engaging in activities that, don't level the playing field or, yeah.
Okay, so this signals a future state. So aside from thinking about voluntary codes and standards, is there anything organizations should be doing between now and that final state?
So they should all be certainly participating in the consultative process of this, in the sense that they should read the PIPEDA paper and let us know what they think about it. We've been fairly, in my mind, comprehensive and fairly actually accessible, in the sense that I actually had people read the paper who don't know about PIPEDA at all and said, like, oh, I kind of got it. Like, it sort of made sense. So, but I think people need to help us operationalize those constructs. And speaking to the previous panel and maybe even to some of the others, I think the notion that's come through in the panels that I've been here for today talk about, partnerships and sector-wide kind of approaches, or, innovation ecosystem-wide approaches, and the need for kind of collaboration. And I'd say, there are a lot of moving parts here that need to join together. I think open banking is a really good one. So, if I say, okay, well, PIPED is going to say that there's some sort of right to portability, or there's some ability to transfer data, but that has to line up with who actually has access to the payment rails, and that actually has to line up with what's going to happen on the open banking side in terms of, the actual standards and approaches that we're going to hold this data in. And that's one where there's actually a relative, robust infrastructure. You apply that in, the retail sector and say, oh, I want to move my information on transactional data from Loblaws to Metro. And none of that infrastructure currently exists. And that's kind of where I'd say, if I was a commercial actor, I'd say, how you have to help us figure out like who's the first mover in some of these spaces, who should be the first mover, where, what is the first piece. And we've tried to lay it out conceptually, but each of those requires a massive amount of kind of actual hard work in terms of concretizing it and making it real. And I just now hate myself more because I proved my public servantness by using the word concretize. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to call you out on that. I don't think you can verb a word like that. Your Twitter feed's going to light up. So let's focus on the PIPEDA paper. It had, the proposals were quite extensive. They've broken down into about 4 categories. So enhancing individuals' control, enabling responsible innovation, enhancing the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada's enforcement oversight, and clarifying the obligations of organizations under PIPEDA. So when we start down this road, is PIPEDA going to end up looking more like the GDPR?
So I think we have the luxury in a couple of these spaces of some would argue being late, and some would argue being wise. And I like to think of it as maybe a combo of the two, which is there are some very good aspects of the General Data Protection Regulation, and I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that it is now, at minimum, at least an international standard for which many, many people have allowed themselves to comply with. That said, it's certainly not what anyone would contend as without its critics or without individuals who would suggest that it could be improved, particularly in some aspects around things like portability, where lots of people in Europe have suggested, okay, you created machine-readable data portability with no infrastructure or no commitment to infrastructure, and then citizens kind of woke up and said, oh, but I can port. Great. Similarly, on the artificial intelligence side, on things like knowability and the degree to which some people feel like knowability is really, an attainable bar to reach, and others who say, if I had been able to do explainability or knowability to my customer, I wouldn't have needed AI in the first place. And so I'd say certainly the paper proposes some elements that are very consistent with GDPR. What I think we have the advantage of, particularly with meaningful insight and meaningful comment from users and from other actors, is, okay, how do we actually make those proposals in the paper real without some of the compliance burden that people felt very, very strongly in the GDPR, and potentially improving upon some of those aspects that people have been more critical of.
So we're looking for a made in Canada solution here. Is that correct?
Made in Canada without being a special snowflake. So I am very cognizant of what we heard loud and clear through various tables, which was, please do not create yet another standard that I have to comply with that somehow is like one standard deviation away from everything else that I'm already complying with. And so I think we're very mindful of that, but I think we also need to recognize we have a unique place. We are one of the few economies that has a very, embedded relationship with our partners to the south, has a free trade agreement on the continent, but also one in Europe, also one in Asia. We're one of the few that has adequacy under the EU, but also has, membership in the APEX cross-border privacy rules. And so, I think we need to be cognizant as we build out PIPEDA that those realities exist, and that we can't just say, yeah, let's take GDPR off the shelf and pop it into the Canadian machine.
So if what should organizations then expect in terms of process in the next little while?
So, it's a weird time, which is also part of the reason why the digital charter and its related actions came out in some of the formats that it did, in that, we are 2 weeks away from my political masters turning into legislative pumpkins, not full pumpkins, and that they still have a while before the writ drops, but we're out of legislative runway. And so the consultation paper for PIPEDA was purposeful in that it allows us the time now to be able to turn this into what we in the public service would call transition advice, which is the ability to advise whatever government of any stripe takes form next. And so I think, in terms of process, there'll be a lot of considered technical consultation over the next little while. There'll be lots of good opportunities for us to hunker down and have some fairly serious conversations right up until probably August. Then we go dark for the writ period, and then we'll reemerge as a out of our chrysalis into a beautiful butterfly that will try and put some of this into more concrete legislative action. So yeah.
So the takeaway here is that organizations should flood your office with comments before August.
And opportunities for dialogue like this. And, I'd say, I hope people feel in the paper, and I can certainly point to a bunch of spaces where, people should see themselves. They should see that the process that actually led us to this point, they can say, oh, like legitimate business interest and trustful and ethical use of data, post-consent as an exception to consent. I remember that workshop that we had with Mark. He was there. So I think people should hopefully take that time to say, what conversations can we have between now and then to inform this broader effort? And not just on PIPEDA, but on CASL, on competition, on intellectual property in a bunch of these spaces. And then on the more general framework of, how would we actually, so on like some of these are more on the programmatic side, like level playing field, and some of them are fully out of my comfort zone on things like, election integrity or strong democracy, where I'd also say if people have thoughts about how we're going to end hate online or ensure that our elections aren't tampered with, there are other people in government who are similarly seeking out how to live out that commitment.
So this is a beautiful vision, and I'm going to wreck it now. So there's the federal privacy legislation and all the federal stuff that we've been talking about, because that is what you do. But there's also those provinces you may have heard of. And some of them have their own private sector privacy legislation. So PIPEDA is charging ahead with the bold new world, grand new things. How's this going to work? Do you have any thoughts on how you reconcile that regime with a provincial regime? Not that you're speaking for the provinces here.
Yeah. So we do have a dialogue amongst our FPT counterparts, federal, provincial, territorial, sorry, I shouldn't use acronyms. And I think one of the hopes is that at the same time as we are furiously working to ensure interoperability and harmonization of privacy regulations with our international peers, that we would be doing the exact same at the provincial and territorial level. And that doesn't just mean hopefully everyone just becomes substantially similar to PIPEDA and we all just get to live under the same regime. I think there are mechanisms that we can figure out how to do that. Not to keep coming back to standard certifications and codes, but I think that the paper explicitly raises the possibility of the privacy commissioner utilizing standard certifications and codes as a mechanism for adherence to the statute, and that potentially if there was actually widespread agreement across multiple jurisdictions, including those within Canada, but also those outside potentially, that is one way in which you start to get to interoperability and privacy harmonization without actually saying, please, bow to someone else's jurisdiction or someone else's law, but instead you say, okay, can we have common approaches that are actually consistent, where I can checkbox and say, I'm GDPR compliant, I'm Apex CBDR compliant, I'm PIPEDA compliant, and it's all through this one certification, and therefore I don't get a free pass from enforcement actions, but I do have at least a good due diligence defense to say I did everything I could, I checked all the boxes. But that takes significant amounts of work. It's not unlike the last panel that said, like, can't we all just do PS2 or other things? I think there are these tough questions to say, how are we going to get there, and who's going to set that standard, and how are we going to agree on it?
Okay. So on that, let's now turn to enforcement, which I'm sure people are interested in. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada has repeatedly called for bigger, stronger, more scope in its enforcement powers. Many other international data protection authorities have some form of enforcement powers, some of them quite significant. So are we at a point now where enforcement of privacy laws is necessary in Canada?
So I'd say I'd quote back my minister, who definitely in the launch of the digital charter and the related kind of efforts has said, there needs to be real consequences for bad actions, particularly related to privacy, and they need to be meaningful, and they need to be a dissuasion from bad actions. So I'd say yes, we definitely are on a road towards some form of stronger enforcement. Not to keep coming back to the paper, but one of the things that I think that we've tried to do in the paper is say enforcement is actually an umbrella term that people kind of use as sort of this general kind of approach towards a regulator or an oversight body, and we actually need to compartmentalize very discrete kind of sets of actions. And I think what we've tried to ask in the paper is, should all of those be held by the same entity, and what's the relationship between them? So you've got advocacy, which is, rah privacy. It's really important, which is an important effort. You've got advice, which is, hey, I want to do this new thing. It's really, whiz bang and innovative. How do I go about doing it, in a way that's privacy compliant? You then got investigation. Someone's complaining. Someone has to look into it and figure out whether there's actual cause or harm being done. And the last is, okay, no, there was, and now we need to dole out fines or penalties or other things. And I think those are 4 discrete functions, and it's not necessarily clear to us that all 4 of those belong in the same entity. And there are various models out there, and I think that's why the paper is a bit open-ended to say, help us think through some of that. If I relate it back to the Competition Act, I'd say, well, there's a particular mode in that. They're an advocate, so they have a market advocacy function. They have less of an advice function. That's mostly what we've related back to the private sector and others. There's an investigation function, and then almost all of penalties either lives in one of 2 fashions. One is it's on consent, so it's in agreement with parties, or if it's not on consent and you want to do something that you can't get consent for from the parties, you go to the competition tribunal, and so then you've got court oversight. Arguably we have a somewhat similar system under the Privacy Act, under PIPEDA right now, but it's not quite the same in the sense that what you can bring to the federal court and how you can bring it and what kinds of penalties you can extract are very different.
So if you enhance the enforcement powers, that whole constellation, is there a way to do that without stifling innovation or unduly burdening organizations with that compliance burden, which is already fairly significant?
Yeah. I think we have to. I think, not everyone loves the fact that our statute actually explicitly says that it actually is trying to do 2 things. One was actually fuel innovation and the other was protect privacy, and to actually bring those 2 together. PIPEDA is actually an innovation boosting statute. That's what it's intended to do. So I think we have to think about ways, and as I said, that's not going to come solely on the part of government. That's in part also going to come from other actors that say, yeah, we get it, and we've done our own thing over here to try and ensure that we can actually minimize the amount that this statute has to do. Because if PIPEDA has to carry the entire burden of restoring trust for Canadians, then watch out for what comes with that enforcement, because that's not a happy kind of approach to getting people to yes, and getting people to adoption and getting people to trust. So if that's where we need to get to because no one else is kind of stepping up and saying no, and I'm not saying that's what's happening. I think there's lots of good stuff happening in that space, but I'd say that partnership has to continue because that was the genesis for this whole effort. Was we are, one more breach away potentially from an entire segment of population that are data Luddites, that are the equivalent of keeping their data under the digital mattress and saying, I don't want to participate, or I'm only going to participate in these functions. And that's not reasonable, both for all sorts of reasons, including bias in algorithms, including the society we want to build. Yeah, never mind innovation.
So just on that point a little more, so how should then privacy be enforced in Canada? What I'm hearing from you is it can't all live in one statute. So what would that enforcement landscape look like, or what could it look like?
Yeah, so I think we do need to look at enforcement mechanisms. I think we do need to. It is appropriate time to take a look at whether or not we have sufficient penalties to be incentives. And I go to functions with lots of corporate actors who say, do we really need stronger penalties? Tell me someone who's rejected advice from the OPC, and now at least I can throw them at least 3 or 4 where I can say, yeah, there are 3 or 4 people who have legitimately suggested they do not fall under the remit of the OPC or do not think that his advice is useful. So I think there is room on the enforcement side. I think one of the luxuries we have in Canada, and one of the weird kind of positions of my job, is I have no international comparator to me. In Europe, I am at least two silos. I'm not quite Commissioner Vestager, although I love her office. It's beautiful if you ever get the chance to go and see it. But I am DG Comp and EU privacy, and I think we have the luxury of being able to say, let's look across this panoply of marketplace frameworks of these laws of general application, and let's figure out which lever should do which piece. So let's not try and use privacy to get an antitrust, and let's not try and do antitrust through privacy through antitrust, because And then intellectual property the same way. Let's not try and regulate certain digital environments by either other mechanisms of copyright or patents when actually, they're best left to something else. And so that's not a whole answer to say who should enforce, but I'd say we need to use all of the tools in the toolbox. And that's why we have actually put, in many cases, all of the tools out to say, okay, which piece is which? So, at the same time as we put out the PIPEDA paper, the minister wrote to the Commissioner of Competition. At the same time as that, we're receiving the advice of the Copyright Review. At the same time as that, there's a panel looking at telecom and broadcasting. Then there's open banking.
You're very busy.
Yeah, it's
that's all you.
Thankfully, not telecom broadcasting, just the copyright linkage.
So earlier you mentioned standards, codes, voluntary sorts of things. Where does that fit? Can you expand on that? And sort of the follow-up question: if things are voluntary codes or standards, where does the enforcement of those? Do we need enforcement, or do we just trust organizations?
Well, I think there's a couple. I think there's a full spectrum, right? There's like the purely voluntary, which is literally just, stuff that I think can actually help shore up trust and actually kind of get the relationship with citizens and consumers better, which is like data for good initiatives, kind of highlighting the real benefits to consumers and citizens of some of what data is actually producing in the economy and in society. Because I'd say that the vast majority of citizens are being, barraged with nothing but the bad news, nothing but like, your data got hacked, everyone's looking at you, everyone's watching every move you make. I know you just thought about peanut butter and now there's an ad on your social media.
How does that happen? Could you explain that? Is that you too?
I have no idea. Anyway, so that's kind of on the far end of like purely voluntary, purely not regulated at all. Just like, can we have more actors coming out and figuring out how to convince people that the data and digitally driven economy is not a scary place? All the way through then to potentially, regulated standards. And, I won't suggest that that's where we're heading. That's more a question for you wearing your other hat. But I'd say like, there are governments that have said, okay, we're going to actually have regulated standards in some of these places. So maybe that's the case in healthcare. Maybe that's the case, in the UK's approach to open banking, they said, we're gonna design the standard and we're going to regulate it because that's the only way we think we can get to a fair market outcome. And so I'd say within that is like a huge range. And so some of that's already happening, some of that's already kind of taking place, but I would encourage folks to kind of think about from that full spectrum of like just being a good corporate data digital actor all the way through to potentially suggesting that actually we need a common approach. We actually need this to be legislated or regulated or else no one's going to potentially follow through. I think we should look across the whole panoply of those to say what needs to be there. I'd say we took a fairly extraordinary step in the PIPEDA paper of actually saying maybe actually if the OPC was the accreditor in some of these cases and that they actually counted as, kind of your PIPEDA compliance. And that's not to say that you, as I say, that doesn't rule out enforcement action against you, but actually your accreditation was held by the actual regulator to say this standard is good enough. And if that standard actually had international play in the sense that it wasn't just for PIPEDA, but actually maybe it also included APEX CPPR or other things, that starts to get pretty meaningful in terms of why you'd buy in and why you should participate, and also why you should make sure that that's the right standard. Because otherwise, if the keys to the international kingdom are a standard that you can't live with or that you hate, that's not awesome either.
Yeah, okay. You'd already touched on the fact that we are starting to enter the silly season. So in light of that, what can organizations do over, say, the next 18 months or so? As, for instance, should certain sectors be looking at drawing up voluntary codes? Should they be organizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've telegraphed quite a bit of potential future direction, right? So I think that, the people during the consultations were saying, we should start work on a certification standard for privacy. And at the time we didn't have the PIPEDA white paper out, and it was more challenging to say like, well, that's nice and you can do that, but just so you know, like two things. One is we're never ever again going to do what created PIPEDA, and that we're never going to take a voluntary standard that was developed by the private sector and turn it into law, not least of which because the courts absolutely hate it. But second of all, make sure you're kind of directing a standard to where we're going, not to where we are. Now there is some sense of potentially at least what's in the world of the possible about where we're going. So I wouldn't kind of weigh in one way or the other about whether or not now's the time, but certainly I think the the thinking about how organizations could conceptualize and make real the constructs that are in the PIPEDA paper and how they could potentially hold themselves to account that they've actually lived those out in meaningful ways. I'd also say on the infrastructure questions, like the infrastructure questions are not small. And I do think we need some people to start thinking about the infrastructure questions. And I would kind of put them in like 3 camps. I think there are places potentially where there is a huge market incentive to creating that infrastructure and people will do it and they'll compete on it potentially. There's kind of a middling ground where we need to be very wary about potential dominant infrastructure being created and us actually now creating a kind of system where people are subservient to a particular infrastructure that's actually proprietary in nature. And then there's like this third camp of places where there might not actually be that much of a market incentive, but actually there's significant consumer value. And what kind of incentive would the government or others need to put in place to actually make that real?
And perfectly on time. You're amazing. So I am going to pause it right now and open the floor to questions if you have any.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. What I read so far of the PIPEDA was a great paper, so certainly kudos on that. And when we compare with Europe, I think it made a lot of sense. There is a rumbling rumor in the AI community, certainly on my side of the country, with the accent you may guess, I'm from Montreal, and that British BC, yeah, that's it. And basically there's a rumbling rumor that we should create and innovate, to your point of innovate in creating a banking of personal information in Canada and sell it to whoever wants to use it. And therefore we could create potentially a new bank worth a few billions in a few years, instead of leaving this value to the other companies around the world. And obviously it doesn't, the issue is not to stop them, but certainly to stop them of doing another Cambridge Analytics or things like that.
Oui. Merci pour la question. C'est possible aussi de poser la question en français, s'il vous plaît. But I'll answer in English because we're in Toronto. But wait, I think what you speak of in kind of general concept terms of how I would approach the question is, there's a lot of good discussion going on right now about data trusts. There's lots of good discussion going on about what a data trust could and should look like and who should be the originator of that data trust. I would be very wary about a bank of personal information or data that potentially was kind of amassing all sorts of kind of one-stop shop, which is why I'm very pleased by some of what I'm seeing in terms of the experimentation around data trust as an experimental governance mechanism, and it looks very different depending on the sector. So, I'll give a couple of concrete examples that the strategic innovation fund that my department administers and runs for the government recently made a couple of really interesting announcements around what we call SIF, Strategic Innovation Fund Stream 4, which was in the health and data space. It's creating kind of novel governance models around trying to democratize health data and bring value back to the actual contributors and the subjects of that data in novel ways. Similarly, Sustainable Development Technologies Canada, SDTC, our clean tech kind of operating agency, Crown Corp, has kind of similarly been experimenting in this space around pooling data from different clean tech projects and trying to figure out whether or not there's actually non-personal data that could be better leveraged across common platforms. So, and people have started to kind of play with that construct. And then similarly, the successful recipients of the first round of Smart Cities funding under my colleagues from Infrastructure Canada have a number of kind of pilots in this data governance, data trust space of saying, what would a pooled asset be? And then finally, I'd say the PIPEDA white paper actually kind of gives rise to the possibility of, can we actually incentivize data trusts in PIPEDA? And I kind of imagine a world where we could actually end up in a space where, in the same way that you have a broker for your financial investments, you may end up in a space where you actually have a broker for your data investments, and that that we actually have a competitive landscape of data trusts run in different ways. And maybe I tell them that I'm, purple in my risk profile. I like my data to generally be hard down, like locked down and not super available, but I'm willing in the following spaces, particularly in health and cancer research or other things, but not on the commercial side. And then maybe there's someone who's like red, who's like, give it all away, but I want value back. So I think we are experimenting with the construct. I think you will start to hopefully see some of these kind of folks who are acting on behalf of consumers and citizens to monetize on their behalf and return that value to them. I think we need to be very cautious about it. I think the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, has had some bad examples of what happens when that goes wrong, and that everyone supposedly is consented to this data trust model, and then suddenly they find out that a large pharmaceutical firm is actually the beneficiary of their data, and the investment in local hospitals didn't really feel real enough for them as the value they got back. So all that to say is, I think we're very up on the construct. I just don't know that it's going to be singular, and I think it needs some experimentation as a governance mechanism, depending on sector and type.
Other questions? We have time for one more.
I bored them all.
No, I hear breathing. All right, I think that is it. We will take our leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you.